Our first order of business will be the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we have approval of minutes from the January 28th, 2019 ad hoc committee meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Okay, Lena, has anyone signed up to speak from the public?
I'll be brief. I didn't know I could speak. So my name is Chris Fellow. I live at Tampa, Florida, 33605 in Ybor City. I just was listening a little bit about the budget and so forth. I just wanted to remind folks that CSX has been in the plans for decades. There is so much potential with this to serve a lot of underserved communities that are out there. We're talking about rail lines that connect from literally from a body of water to another body of water in the most densest areas and most job opportunity areas that we have. It is sustainable as well. We could easily look at reducing our climate footprint by putting a lot more resources into CSX. And if we are able to do that, we can go into a market where we can get green bonding, we can look at having more self-sustaining developments, more protective developments, and have more access to goods and services that are much more predictable than relying on roads and just any type of other underwhelming transportation solutions. I think what we need to do is we need to step back. If we are really serious as CSX as a committee, we need to look at, as we're expanding the bus service, increasing bus frequency, how does that tie holistically into the system, right? So I would urge this committee to really listen to this TOD report, take it seriously, and know that there's several parts that do attach to the CSX line and also streetcar and BRT. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to address the committee? Seeing no one, we have two presentations today. The first, Chris Cochran, FTA TOD pilot program update. Thank you, Chris.
Good morning, committee. Chris Cochran, Director of Service Development. This morning here to give you an update on the FTA Transit-Oriented Development Pilot Program study that we were awarded from FTA. First of all, give you a little overview again of the purpose. It's been a little while since you all have seen a presentation on this, and give you a little timeline of where we're at and an updated schedule. So again, the purpose of this study is really an opportunity for the FTA to provide funding to agencies to really support their overall mission of creating economic development opportunities, increasing ridership and multimodal connectivity, accessibility, these types of opportunities in communities through providing funding and looking at transit-oriented development in corridors that are specifically slated for capital investment grant projects. So just to keep in mind, these are all of the projects that were awarded by FTA are specifically for projects in corridors that are slated for capital investment grant opportunities. So again, in December of 2018, we were one of 20 agencies, along with our partners, City of Tampa, the Planning Commission, at the county, to awarded for a total project of $1 million. FTA put up $800,000, and there was a $200,000 match as part of that. And ultimately, it is in support of the envisioned Tampa streetcar extension and the current our Tampa arterial BRT study that HART is embarking on. So again, looking at the study areas here, we see the current preferred streetcar alignment on the left that this study will have an opportunity to look at some of the station areas around this corridor and looking at policy and land use opportunities around these stations, as well as the corridor on the right that we are currently studying for the Tampa arterial BRT study. The study goals here are really to establish a methodology to assist in the development of a regulatory framework to look at the future creation of station areas and TOD development in these specific corridors. But again, a repeatable methodology that we can implement elsewhere throughout Hillsborough County and potentially at a broader scale in the Tampa Bay region as well. Some of our desired outcomes here. We have a whole list of outcomes that our group has identified, including, again, this replicable methodology for station area planning, updating the land use code as it pertains to TOD, looking at the opportunities for land use incentives to promote TOD, public-private partnership opportunities, looking at new technologies in this realm, and ultimately looking at how this study can be complementary to other transit studies kind of within this sphere of influence. The study task specifically designated for this in the scope of work look at 4 specific tasks, and one is looking at land use. The second is policy. The third is station area design, and then ultimately, how do we implement what we have specifically looked at within these individual tasks within these corridors. And again, ultimately, we're measuring our success on our ability to be able to create this repeatable methodology that could be replicated throughout Tampa and Hillsborough and the region. An outline of the funding here, a much clearer outline here is the, oh, you don't have the handout, I'm sorry. Sorry. This spells out the contributions, the local contribution as it's split up between HART, the city, and the Planning Commission, as well as the federal match. The FTA putting up $800,000. HART is putting up an $80,000 cash contribution. And between the city and the Planning Commission, there is a $120,000 in-kind contribution by way of staff time and leveraging their knowledge and contribution that way. Thank you. Currently, we're looking at a procurement timeline to be able to get a consultant in working on this. Our goal is to have this out here around August 26th is our current goal to have this put out. The contract award kind of late fall with the project timeline kicked off in early winter, kind of around the beginning of the year. And there's 3 phases of this. The first phase will be looking at those 3 tasks, specifically in the Tampa streetcar alignment. The second task will look at the BRT alignment only in the north-south corridor of the arterial BRT study. And the third phase will be taking those tasks and looking at the Fowler corridor, east-west, between essentially the freeway and the end of the line. And our expectations are to have final recommendations by the end of the year in 2021.
Chris, do you intend to bring to this committee the results of each of the milestones? Is that the game plan?
Absolutely, yes, sir. Yes, sir. So as part of each one, the task will be completed in each one of those 3 corridors. or sections of the corridor, and then there will be a public outreach process after each one of those sets of tasks are done, and we will be able to come back to you and report on those milestones as we move forward. Again, this is our updated timeline. You can see we have a needs analysis for each phase, and then a public outreach after each one, and that's repeated for each one of the segments, and then final recommendations in the winter of 2021.
I just have
So that's a brief update.
Thank you. I just wanted, when you say with the RTO, right, so you're just talking about Nebraska and Florida avenues and Fowler, and you're talking about TOD with regards to street level, correct?
Correct. There will obviously be consideration of all the studies that are going on in the area, and understanding that there may be other projects going on, but this is looking at the BRT study. That is a at-grade project, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner.
Chris, thank you very much for your presentation. When you go back to the study tasks and the items you list are land use policies, station area design, and implementation. With the many hats I wear these days, the two pieces that got my attention the most, although station area design obviously is at street level, is going to be interesting given how dense a lot of those corridors are. But the land use and policy are something that actually I wanted to bring to your attention if you don't already know. Currently, a hat I wear is the Hillsborough County's Affordable Housing Advisory Board. Previously, it's operated much like a committee rather than a board, and the Board of County Commission is evaluating restructuring that particular position that will allow for a voting member from HART and a voting member from the Planning Commission to sit on that board as it pertains to how we address our needs in the area for affordable housing and what recommendations we can make in the area of land use for areas specifically that can and need protection, and those are our TOD corridors. Because those areas oftentimes can be very attractive to investment, but also can preclude or eliminate opportunities for affordable housing, which is why it's so critically important that we develop a good strategy in the policy to allow for those communities that are already somewhat dense in terms of housing that would ultimately end up being gentrified if it becomes a very attractive way of investing in that area to take advantage of the transit investment. So I wanted to bring that to this committee to make sure you're aware, so that the board can decide who on the overall board, or whether it be someone from this board that may be interested in taking one of those positions. Because my goal there was not only to have all the cities will have a seat, a voting seat, which was not always the case, and we've added planning commission as well as, and not a staff level, but a planning commission person as well as someone from HART. So that as it plays into the TOD studies, I'd like to make sure that one, we're aware of that, and two, that we consider who we would want to sit on that board. I sit on it now, being from the Board of County Commission, but that's why I was interested in this particular committee too. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Mr. Smith, I assume that's either a HART full board or the chairman appointment. Is
Correct.
Which would it be? I mean,
It could be the one, the chairman, if it's an ad hoc. This is going to be a participatory committee. You have some committees that are determined pursuant to the process where you nominate yourself and there's a vote. For example, I think T-BARTA may be of that nature, or the MPO is of that nature. There are certain boards that are voted on by the board. Certain board participations are voted on by the board. Others are appointed by the chair. Mm-hmm. This is not among the list, so it's going to be a policy issue decided by the board.
Okay. Well, I would suggest that be brought up to the chairman and the board at the next scheduled meeting.
Correct.
Right. And that's specifically why I brought it up at this meeting. because it really does, the Affordable Housing Board itself really needs guidance in the area of how we identify not only resources, but how we partner with agencies that create an opportunity for affordable housing. And transit is a key linkage that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely,
And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it to this board.
Thank you. Mr. Hearn?
So on the study task, well, first, I guess the scope, my question with regards to this particular $1 million budget, is this the 2 study areas identified here, are those, were those identified in the FDOT grant, or is that staff's opinion of what we should study?
It was originally identified in the application and the study, so it is locked into specifically the study.
And that was both the streetcar expansion and the what I would assume would be a bus rapid transit corridor, but the Florida, Nebraska corridors. Okay. And so is it the feeling that, can the scope of that be expanded slightly if you're able to get more services for the $1 million, or do you feel like that study is going to require the whole $1 million?
You know, the way it was originally priced, we felt very comfortable that was the amount of money that would be needed to make an adequate study that we're looking to get what we're hoping to get out of it. But it is specifically locked into that corridor at this point. There really isn't flexibility to expand it to any other areas of the city.
So with regards to the study tasks, land use policy, station area design implementation. So I think specifically, there's a missing study task, I think, which is the most important perhaps, but that's analysis of the effect on the ad valorem tax base on these corridors. So I mean, if we need actionable intelligence to come out of this. So I think what we need to avoid is regurgitating, like what is actually a fairly robust 2040 plan that we have. I'll grant you that we're lacking in the city of Tampa zoning ordinances to implement all the provisions of the 2040 plan. But I think that the most important thing that we can push forward as a HART board to really the Board of County Commissioners, I would assume, and/or the City Council would be information regarding what potential lift in the taxable value of these properties will be created by the investment that the HART board is going to make with its transportation, surtax. So, and then, because as we look forward, in my mind, we're the agency tasked with operating this new transit when it's in place. But we need to be creative about how we're going to be able to pay for the infrastructure, the stations, and all that stuff. So, I think one of the most important study tasks then is basically a financial analysis of the ad valorem tax lift for these corridors. Okay. So, additionally, then land use. I mean, land use, so that's a pretty general statement, but I think very specifically that we're looking at zoning provisions in both the city of Tampa, and I think when we turn on Fowler, are we in the county at that point, or no?
This is all in the city of Tampa.
All in the city. So for the purpose of this initial study, not your outline for future ones, then we need to, I think, be very specific about zoning regulations that can implement both the desired outcome of the study, but also the comprehensive plan.
I was going to disagree with you on Fowler. On the south side of Fowler, it's the city. On the north side of Fowler, it's the county. So Fowler is one of those weird roads where there is a bit of a shift, and I don't know if it even goes all the way across the street. It may go through the middle of the sidewalk on the north side, but it is right on the border of the county.
And also with that, I know you're just studying Fowler. I was just saying how I really think that one of those lines should go up on Fletcher and the other should come across Fowler. So again, that would be kind of, I know you're just looking at the, as it's configured now, but, or I guess as it's configured now, but because you're not studying Fletcher area, but that would also be county. But to your point, and I was thinking about this when I saw it, I know Sunrail in Orlando, they started studying it, I guess, it was FDOT, again, an FDOT funded study that I've read, and they did it they did a baseline in 2011. They opened in 2014, they expanded last year, but since 2011, they've had $2 billion in new investment in the corridor along the Sunrail, and that's brought $200 million more in taxable assets or tax base to them along that corridor. And I saw a chart, which actually I showed at a presentation just the other day, where it outlined what would be anticipated had it just gone without Sunrail there, and the impacts that Sunrail had above it, because I know that is sometimes some of the controversy I've read about these kind of baselines, also with the Health Line in Cleveland and the billions of dollars that they've talked about has been invested. Of course, that was a downtown line, but it certainly seems to have, in many ways, impacted hugely the transit-oriented development that has occurred around it. So I guess that this is that kind of study to set a baseline, and I hadn't seen predictors from that study, but after the fact. So this looks like it's a more or less supposed to be kind of a baseline predictor and for future use.
I think it has an opportunity to do a lot of that, yes. But I think a lot of it is also at understanding where our policies exist today that need to be addressed so that we can progress towards those opportunities and being able to have better value capture opportunities and promote better TOD wherever those station areas end up being. So so in that sense, yes, it's understanding where we're at and where we need to go.
One of the issues I've always had is the cross-jurisdictional issue of stations and stops and placement. I was just noticing the other day when I drove somewhere, I saw because there's such a narrow right-of-way there, and we have so many, all these streets are all state properties, the Florida, Nebraska, they're all state roads. So, and one of the things I just witnessed yesterday when I was at a stop, I saw that there were some people in a bus shelter, I can't even remember where I was, and a pedestrian coming down the sidewalk, and the bus shelter, the right-of-way was so narrow that the bus shelter was placed on the sidewalk, and the person coming down the sidewalk walked around the bus shelter to get to the other side as the bus was loading. So in terms of finding right-of-way on a state road, which these are all state roads, even for bus pull-in, reasonable bus stations, walkability and all that, and I don't know if, I guess FDOT never does condemnation or anything like that for to get that right-of-way to provide for good pedestrian access and stops, or, I mean, is that going to be part of this?
I mean, obviously, all of that is certainly a challenge, obviously, all of that has to be looked at and considered as to what's realistic that we can do. But again, it's looking at what is there today and what kind of land use policy do you need to be able to put into place so that when that car dealership is gone, when you put something in after that, you're forcing them to be set back, as we're beginning to see some of those 4- and 5-story developments, they're being set back, and we're being able to create opportunities for space to be able to better serve transit. So I hope that answers your question.
Commissioner.
Thank you. That's actually why it's so critically important through this process that we partner with the city of Tampa as well as the county on land use, but also on overlays. Because, for example, years ago, I would argue with our city's development office and their overlay plans and FDOT on the choice to put the buildings right up against the sidewalk, right up against the road, because that was the plan to slow traffic down. And I'm like, how does that work? So it made no sense to me, but we unfortunately have corridors because of our past land use and zoning rules that have put buildings right up against the sidewalk that give you very little in the way of right-of-way options. That's going to be a quagmire that's going to be a bit messy through this process, but there are places within these corridors where there is significantly underdeveloped opportunities that we need to be very cautious and vocal in coordinating with both the city and the county on that particular challenge. Because without changes in our zoning and in each of the partners areas, whether that be City of Tampa, Temple Terrace, Plant City, or the county, not recognizing that opportunity for what the TOD requirements should look like and create those corridors in our bus plan, expansion plan, it's going to be very important that we create those corridors that can be best utilized.
To your point, I think it's very important to understand that, what comes out of this study is the opportunity to hand over those recommendations to the city and for them to implement and make those changes to be able to.
Well, also the city is a participant in this process.
Yes, that's why they are.
I don't think the county is, although I questioned that the last time because we do need to clear up whether or not some of the study area includes unincorporated Hillsborough County, in which case I think you would want to include county staff in the discussions,
Good morning, Jay Collins, Planning Commission staff. Just to let you know again, the policy language that is in the comprehensive plan for the city of Tampa and for unincorporated Hillsborough County is exactly the same. So what happens within the city of Tampa's will also happen to unincorporated Hillsborough County. And you are correct in the fact that on Fowler Avenue, you do have unincorporated Hillsborough County directly to the north there, such as the mall and some of those other properties in there. Some of your questions that you have, the short answer to is all options are on the table. And that's what this grant is doing for us. It's going out and asking consultants to look at these existing plans, find station areas, and then do the implementation for that language so that we can actually take that station area plan from the cradle all the way through a roaring adulthood to where we will be able to start to see what it's like to have transit-oriented development within our community. We have neighborhood plans, we have community plans, we have a variety of different public participation projects that we have worked with our communities for years, but we've never done this. And that is really where we are with it, is to ask those questions of how the public will actually look at these new plans that we're doing and react to them with us as we do this policy language side by side and have those conversations for the next 2 years, and then hope that what we get out of it is something that can be replicated. And that goes back into some of your other conversations that you have where you were starting to ask questions about other corridors. What happens along Florida and Fowler and Nebraska in the Palm Avenue area, we hope can also happen along Del Mabry if that's where the next bus rapid transit is. Or if it's a CSX line where a station area can land on that CSX line. This isn't a one-shot deal. We hope that what we end up with in 2 years can go everywhere throughout the county. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Chris. Just a quick comment, and this is kind of a general comment. Actually, I had the privilege really to participate in a technical advisory panel up in Jacksonville on TOD, and I just wanted to add, I know that I'm sure there are constraints with the procurement and with the scope of the study, but two of the most robust things that came out of it was a 2-day, it was almost like just an intense brainstorming. We went out and looked at sites. It was
pretty incredible. We had developers there, some folks from Qatar, and just and banking, this interesting mix of people. To the extent that the scope will allow engagement of the private sector in the actual study, because I think to the point that was made earlier, Mr. Arden's point, actually, the financial analysis piece. There's the financial analysis piece from an ad valorem standpoint, but also just the pro forma of the developer. You know, how, and thank you, and then also what type of land uses are needed, but then also are going to be attractive to the developer, and what is the nexus between the two. So I definitely, you know, one of the things that I'm encouraged by is the location of the sites that were selected in the grant. When we did the TAP in Jacksonville, the trend I saw was the sites that we recommended were sites that were closer to the CBD. Again, not to jump the shark here or spoil the results of the study, but and also with development potential. You know what was existing there, and what were some of the different amenities and things around the area. Some of the natural recurring things like parks and you know, things that enrich people's lives. So. But I just wanted to point out that engagement with the private sector, to the extent you guys can do that in the study and figure out, wow, you know, what is that financial differential that is going to, again, from a policy standpoint, the trend seems to be, you know, to your point, Commissioner, what policy constraints are there? Let's kind of change those, you know, get those out of the way, quote unquote, or not to quote you, but you know, just kind of getting policies adjusted. But then what is that financial piece, and what does that look like? I think that's an important part of the financial analysis. So, and the private sector, by being engaged at that stage, can give you that feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, did you finish your presentation? I don't.
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll move on.
I'm sorry, I apologize. We're laboring this, and I just want to, so looking at study tasks, we're talking about putting out a request for services, right? So,
Yes, sir.
And we don't want to delay that. I mean, I think we all wish this would have been out on the street 6 months ago, but so some of the things we talked about today, I think, are things that are actually covered by another study that we're doing in parallel, which is really the right-of-way or corridor study for the transit-oriented development, right, for BRT.
That's really not focused too much on, there's really not as significant of a TOD component to
Right.
that study.
Agreed, but when
But
we
this is
talk about,
absolutely in parallel.
but the conversation expanded to include issues with right-of-way and other things that I think, that will be covered by the other study, or should be, is that correct?
In the sense that the recommended study stop areas, not necessarily exact stop locations, but stop areas that are recommended from the BRT study will inform this study for us to be able to look at,
Okay.
you know, some of the areas we want to focus on.
So will you bring this back to the full board, what this RF, request for services or request for proposals, is going to look like before it goes out? Or are you going to refine the study tasks or what the deliverables are? Or?
We were hoping to have it out here in the next week or two.
Yeah,
But
okay.
if that's, you know, it's.
Well, if you want to email it around, I'd be happy to comment on it when we see it.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good
Yeah,
idea.
because certainly we don't want to slow it down.
We're in a
but-
position we can have that to you today.
So, you know, and I appreciate the comments from the planning commission staff, and just as somebody who, you know, I know that Dave works in land use related issues as well, but I think that if we can come out of this again with actionable information that can assist the city council and the county commission to make decisions, and in my personal opinion, that information is, you know, this study task of land use. The information is, for example, the city of Tampa needs to have a more robust urban mixed-use zoning category, which specifically matches up with the urban mixed-use land use categories like urban mixed-use 60, residential mixed-use 100. It does not have a zoning to be able to implement that land use. And so, you know, the city council, you know, if they had a specific recommendation and maybe examples from other communities of a land use category that would allow the implementation of urban mixed-use 60 land use in the zoning code, then that would be something we need to come out of this study with. And then again, more specifically, just to make my point again, is we need information about, example, this section of Florida Avenue between Hillsborough Avenue and Sly currently has an ad valorem tax base of X. And this percentage of the structures are depreciated or fully depreciated. And then if we take that and compare it to a transit-oriented corridor in Orlando, here's where we anticipate that the ad valorem tax would land. So that, again, as we then look to these decisions like, oh, we need to get some right-of-way down one side of the street to implement this corridor plan, then, again, the county commission, the city council can say, okay, we can bond that. There's a potential income stream from the lift of the transit-oriented development. We'll put a TIF district around it, and this is a tool that is available and is anticipated by the comprehensive plan, the concept of these TODs being able to self-fund or partially self-fund themselves. But again, the elected leaders who would be in charge of that need specific actionable information to come out of this study that we're spending $1 million on. So I'm done. Thank you.
I just have one other.
Okay. One.
It's an amen, and it's a great point, and I couldn't help but hear the word return when you were talking. Return on investment. Am I right, Mr.
Yeah,
Gerard?
exactly.
Right, whether it's the county or developer, and I think so. Just amen to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think you have heard today, you have a very proactive TOD committee. And so you'll be expecting to get a lot more feedback as we proceed here.
That's great to hear.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Next on the agenda is a presentation of Tampa Bay's TOD future, given to us by Taryn Sabia, Director of Florida Center for Community Design and Research. Welcome, Ms. Sabia.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm really excited to hear the conversations about TOD and value capture and affordable housing and walkability. Those are the exact things that we got to look at when doing this study. So for me, talking about transit-oriented development here in my community is probably one of the most exciting pieces of research that I have had the opportunity to partake in. It was about a 6-month study that I'm going to present to you in a short 20 minutes or so. So hopefully I will leave enough time for you to, for us to be able to have a discussion or answer questions, but I'm happy to also meet and talk more about the work that we've done and what we've learned after that. So for those of you that don't know, the Florida Center for Community Design and Research, it was founded in 1986 by the Florida legislature as the research arm for the School of Architecture at USF. Our mission is to assist the citizens of Florida in creating more livable and sustainable communities. So we really take that very seriously, and we appreciate very much the opportunity to take part in valuable work like this. So what we're going to start with is a couple definitions. We looked at transit-oriented development and value capture. So when we look at transit-oriented development, we're looking at that compact, walkable, dense, mixed-use area near transit. And that's really the key piece, right? Is that when we talk about TOD, it really is the layering of systems. It doesn't work without the transit, and the development won't happen without it, and vice versa, right? That development also helps sustain ridership and really create a robust system where we're getting people to and from where they need to go and providing the necessary amenities near where they live and work. So when we look at value capture in conjunction with that, we're looking at the value that is harnessed from transit, conferring it to the properties around it. So we're going to go through a few different strategies, and we'll show you some examples and case studies that we've looked at. So these are some of the areas that we've looked at throughout the country that utilize value capture and transit-oriented development together. And so what we have is a big opportunity to really look at creating a transit-oriented development master plan that would utilize value capture as a significant component of that, and to be able to set some goals that have metrics attached to them in order to do so. A number of you have brought up similar strategies and have talked about them already this morning. So one of the things that we really focused on was looking at best practices. What are those best practices? How can we break them down? What are communities really getting at? And so those best practices really come by way of looking at performance-based metrics, right? So we want there to be goal-oriented visions that have metrics attached to them so that we can see and measure how we're growing, and we can make sure that we're achieving all of those big goals. Other pieces that we looked at in terms of best practices were value capture methods and strategies. We looked at station area design standards. So I'm trained as an architect and an urban designer by background. So it means I deal with the built environment quite a bit. I deal with architecture, landscape architecture, policy, planning, and all of the things that go with it. And so for me, that design piece is really key. I heard some of you talking about walkability, the placement of the buildings. That's why the design and the design standard that we build into the land development regulations are so important, because it allows us to be able to address those pieces. We also looked at specific zoning and land use strategies. And finally, we did a bit of a concept utilizing what we learned for best practices for 3 different scales of TOD in the Tampa Bay area. And the one I'll show you today is the one from Hillsborough. So under performance-based, there were several categories that stood out as being significant. We saw them in a lot of places, and we thought that these were the ones that really should be modeled. They included support for 21st century transit, advancing equity, mix of uses, leveraging investment, creating healthy communities, affordability, and sustainability. And these all had measures, and we're going to look at a couple case studies. So one that we feel was really one of the most robust is going to be BART in San Francisco. They have some of the best performance-based metrics in terms of how they're measuring their value creation. So they're looking at how that value creation really helps them to achieve a vision for quality of life, and they have quality of life standards that they have identified as being important. And again, this is a transit agency that is working in conjunction with land use, right? They're bringing those two things together, and I think that that's a really key layering aspect that we would want to model. The next one is going to be LA. And one of the key pieces in LA is that they have certain goals that they're trying to achieve. One is to reduce housing and transportation costs combined, and to reduce dependence on the automobile. This is significant, and one of the reasons we use this is because when you look at housing and transportation costs for people who live in Hillsborough, we're significantly above the national average. Household income spent on housing and transportation combined in Hillsborough is 56%. National average is 51%. For transit, national average is 19%. Here in Hillsborough, we spend about 26% on transportation alone. So, and I can get you those numbers. They're in the study. They're not here in the presentation, but it's a significant piece. So looking again at that affordability component tied to transit is significant. And if we can reduce transit expenses because of creating TOD access, then we start to really address some of those affordability issues. When we look at value capture, there are a few primary categories and a few secondary categories. So you can see by the little chart too that when transit is announced and a plan is in place, we start to see the growth in value already take shape. So the primary methods were developer fees and extractions, special assessments and taxes, tax increment financing, as Mr. Harden mentioned, joint development, and then secondary methods included naming rights and mobility fees. And we have a few examples of these as well. So I'm giving you just some small case studies. The full report has additional ones. Dallas has really been one of the most successful utilizing tax increment financing across its system. So when taxes are generated in one part of the system, they can be spent in another part. And that's significant because they're improving across all 93 miles. And they've generated $10.8 billion in economic development so far, as well as another $7 billion in economic impact. And that is partly because of that investment. So they're using their tax increment financing for maintenance, they're using it for infrastructure improvements, for pedestrian infrastructure, for bike infrastructure, and other improvements related to the transit being part of those overall plans. And the next one is New Quincy. So New Quincy had joint development. They also had an assessment district. They used some really creative measures, and they used a reimbursement model with developers. And so, you know, they're being creative. And that's one of the key things that we wanted to stress in the study, is that these communities are willing to go outside the typical, you know, ideas, the typical boundaries, and think creatively about how to generate that return and how to use their investment for the biggest creation of value. This is the design piece. So again, this one is really key, because this design component is really how we begin to understand where value around transit areas happens. So if you'll notice that center, that first quarter mile, that's going to be your most walkable area. It's also your most value, your highest value around a transit station area is in that first quarter mile. And then we step out into the half mile. This is going to be your walking and biking zone. You're going to see value increase in that area as well. And then as you go out to the full mile, you're going to see this is where we want to be able to connect with bus circulators and things, bringing people into that core, and this is your transit supportive area. So really understanding how we begin to set those boundaries helps us both understand zoning and the overall need for certain design measures. And one of our example here is going to be the Richmond Highway BRT. This is a dedicated corridor. And the dedicated corridor here really did focus on the idea of complete streets as being part of that corridor. They're looking at having big commercial uses at the street level. And some of the other pieces is just making sure that people have access along the entire length of the corridor to transit, and making sure that those environments are really pleasant for walking, biking, and other uses that are complementary to transit. We have Healthline. I heard you mention Healthline as well. So one of the key components of Healthline that has made it so successful is that it was initially a small transit investment under $200,000, and it led to more than $6 billion in economic development. They utilize naming rights in part in terms of how they helped with value capture. But what they also focused on was context-based design. So every station area has its own identity. They really picked up from the clues from the neighborhoods around their station areas and utilized that to build in and focus on the specific identities, characteristics. It helped to really amplify and enhance those across the system. So the next area that we looked at best practices is going to be zoning. And so zoning should really support the overall goals. So when we look at those performance metrics, we want the zoning to be supportive of those. And we really looked at a few things that stood out in terms of zoning goals that we saw across multiple systems. So the pedestrian-oriented spaces that were integrated in both design and through the zoning and land development regulations, higher densities, helping to support, again, that transit ridership, an increased mix of uses, and limited or no parking minimums. And this was also a piece that was built in to many of our transit agencies and zoning components. So our first corridor here that we're going to look at, again, this is the Richmond example. It's the Pulse corridor. And some of the significant pieces here is that they really did create priority streets. They helped identify those, and the zoning is responding to the scale. So as the scale changes along the corridor, the zoning is responding to that and helping to shape it and shape that scale. So where you go from higher density to medium density, and looking at the street-oriented commercial and making sure that that street-oriented commercial was a significant piece, and has really led to the success of Pulse. This is one of my favorite examples. I also like this diagram. It's from Arlington. They're showing you the walk zones, right? The ones that we talked about, and they're showing you that zoning within those walk zones. And one of the successful pieces from Arlington is they created their own mixed-use categories. Those mixed-use categories have different emphasis and focuses in terms of where they put density. And again, just really looking at creating those transit neighborhoods. And you'll see that some of them overlap depending on where the station areas and stops are. But this one is really a strong, diagram in terms of being able to really read how those station areas work across a corridor. So when we look at station area typologies, this is where we want to see zoning. So one of the things that our final report was recommending is that agencies within Hillsborough and also within Tampa Bay consider adopting the same typologies. And when we did the study, we found that FDOT had its own definitions, the county had its own definitions, the MPO had its own definitions, and HART had its own definitions. Mm-hmm. So, right, coming together would really help make a more robust, cohesive system that could really function holistically. And I think that making these things weave together will help us be much more holistic in our planning in terms of the transit, the affordable housing, the growth, the development, and the value capture, right? So that we can take advantage of all those pieces. So we have some examples, and we have some examples of the densities, but the first one being urban center. Your example is going to be something like downtown Tampa, where we're looking at our highest densities. For our next one, we're looking at the mixed-use business center. So, when we look at a Midtown, which is just getting underway, and things like that, and even West Shore, we're going to start to see a lot of business center development. Institutional center is next, right? So we have our innovation district up by USF, which is kind of ripe for growth. I think many of us can see the growth that could happen there. With a TOD plan, it really helps push those pieces forward. It really helps us direct that growth to where we want it to go. And again, to capitalize on that investment for the biggest return. We're looking also at urban neighborhoods. So this idea of the urban neighborhood, we have a number of them within the city of Tampa and a number of them along the two corridors that have been selected for study already, all the way from Tampa Heights through Seminole Heights to Sulphur Springs. And then as we move with CSX into East Tampa, there's a number of urban neighborhoods that are really ripe for this type of development, for transit and station areas, to begin to help revitalize some of those communities and provide the necessary amenities and also affordability that we need. And then we also have the suburban centers, right? So we can imagine Hyde Park Village, things like that, where we start to see, those kind of dense centers happen within more suburban type neighborhoods, which are still walkable, which still have the amenities for people to be able to get to, and most importantly, still have access to that transit center. So we have a series of questions that we think are really important to ask as part of the study overall, and we think that our local plans should really make sure that they are addressing these questions. So I'm going to just read them out to you because I think they're that important. Have we established goals with measurable outcomes? Again, that's that performance-based piece. Have we identified priority station areas to maximize return on investment? The cheapest piece of property may not be the one that gives us the biggest return. And that's really a key thing that we keep in mind, right? Because we also want to address those quality of life pieces as well. Have we established zoning for TOD which leverages value capture strategies, right? Because we want to make sure that we're not only providing the opportunity for it, but that we're guaranteeing that value capture can happen and that we're setting some rules, standards, and metrics to make sure that we're getting a return that we can count on to help make the system more robust and make it more sustainable over time. And have we created design standards which demand walkable, compact developments that will support transit while expressing the unique identity of our communities? Because this is really important, right? We don't want to lose that unique identity. We want to enhance it, we want to keep it, and we can use the design standards as a way to do that around transit. So we're going to skip through a couple slides so I can get to the Hillsborough ones to show you, because I want to be able to get to those. So one of the areas that we tested out, what we were thinking in terms of looking at zoning, in terms of looking at densities, in terms of looking at a station area around a corridor, is Florida Avenue. So we looked at Florida Avenue just north of Bird and south of Waters, and we placed our walkable quarter mile on there so you can see where we're looking at. And as we start to add to it, you can see that we're beginning to look at what the corridors can be. And when we expand those corridors, we can see that we could really come to the east side of I-275 as well, and that this transit-oriented development could be very large depending on the corridors that are selected for transit. And when we look at potential growth and development, this is some of our most developable area within the city. And when we start to look at, that mix and where we can place it, this is just an idea of the overall kind of density, massing, and scale. And that would be a Florida Avenue concept where you have your transit station at the center. So I realize that Florida Avenue looks a lot different than the one that we're familiar with right now.
You can say that.
And that's the idea, right? That we have much wider sidewalks, that we have places for pedestrians, that we have drop-off zones for people that might be using a ride share or a kiss and ride, and that we have much more walkable streets and places where you have, shade and trees and overhangs and awnings and cafe tables and things at your ground floors, and you have, housing above it. And so this is, a little bit of the study that we did overall, but really beginning to tie in these pieces. This is almost about 5 million square feet that we have put here. And again, like I said, if we also look at expanding that beyond, and when you look at that entire transit supportive zone, there's housing in place already in some of those areas that could be taken advantage of. And this is just one example. There are others. As you look at CSX, if you look at MLK and particularly Hillsborough Avenue, those are key areas. As you look at, the Tampa Heights neighborhood, there's some really rich areas for development and redevelopment. And we really do have an opportunity with value capture to make a true TOD master plan come together. But I think the key piece in this is not just looking at development here, transit here, and zoning here, right? We really need to put those pieces all on top of each other and look at them together, combined with design, and then we really have an opportunity to, dream big and make it achievable at the same time. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Questions, comments? Commissioner?
Comments, awesome. It's just incredible piece of work here, and I'm so happy to see it generated, because I think we do need more of a vision sometimes around this that we don't get. And, I can go around as I know many of us do, to other places in the country where we see it happening, and it's still frustrating. I feel like the kinds of things I see in my own neighborhood in Seminole Heights, I can see all the things happening, but they seem to happen independent and not in coordination with transit or government policy that supports it or in fact works against it frequently, and government investment also that works against it. So this is, I think, I like that, thinking about it and then thinking big about it. And, this is the vision of the future that I like to see and feel like we can move towards.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Taryn, thank you. It's when you're not an architect or a design engineer or any of the wonderful talents and credentials that you have, but you can see this is possible because you've sat through so many different presentations, bringing all of these concepts together, but disparately. You get it in various different places. Living in the urban core, it's helped me understand not only how it works in the urban core, but how our suburban communities can also benefit from these kinds of planning. Perfect example is Bloomingdale.
Yes.
All the development that's going on there is being challenged by how the land use works and how the roads work and the lack of forethought in how we've placed transit as a way of helping people get around. When you build attractive centers like this, where in Florida where you get shade, people will use transit. And what we're looking to do is make sure that ROI is there. And I really appreciate this conversation because it helps cement what our work does for our communities and how we best utilize the resources that we're looking at and the policies that can help support that. So thank you very much for bringing this to our attention and for your work.
John? Well, thank you very much for coming. It's sort of wonderful to see how you can take the existing Tampa and make it into something else.
Beautiful. Yes.
It's just a better version of ourselves.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Slight makeover, that's all. Commissioner?
I just have one I almost don't even know where I came from in here. I was just looking at, I was thinking, what was that in the presentation, the first few slides you showed? But in terms of, I was really interested when I saw the performance-based goals in Los Angeles, California, because they weren't just around like the TOD as like a zoning measure or something, but they were here is more stable transportation costs even when gas prices increase, reduced need to expand freeways and other roads to accommodate new growth, healthier residents as a result of more physical activity, on and on, more sustainable source of transit. So to me, these struck me as being something very different than you usually see. So where do these come in as part of public policy? Is that like a comp plan overall? I mean, how do they incorporate those? How do we incorporate those to make it part of how we judge something?
Yeah, so they've adopted them as part of their plans. So these are written in as the goals with the metrics that get adopted by multiple agencies, so that they all understand the direction that everyone is trying to go as a community. And then, the transit agency reports on the different components within those metrics that they're responsible for, and the other agencies come together and they report on what they're responsible for. So it's really about building those partnerships and then everybody working together to really begin to build and address based on those overall community goals.
I think those are excellent goals. I'd like to see them addressed by all the different layers of agencies we mentioned as part of what we're looking to do when we build our future here.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Nothing else on our agenda, so we are adjourned. Thank you.